I have often observed that the strangest and most instructive cases in the annals of crime are not those which begin with violence, but those which begin with silence, a silence so unnatural that it seems to press upon the senses like a physical weight. It was such a silence that hung over Baker Street on a cold and mist-laden November morning when the affair I am about to recount first found its way into the life of Sherlock Holmes and myself. Holmes had been awake since before dawn. I had heard him pacing in his room above mine, his footsteps measured and irregular, as though he were conducting some invisible experiment upon the very air. When I entered our common sitting-room, I found him seated by the window, wrapped in his dressing-gown, a thin spiral of tobacco smoke curling upward from his pipe. Outside, London lay smothered in a low, oppressive fog. The gas lamps still burned, though it was well past sunrise, their yellow halos trembling like uncertain thoughts in the murk. A hansom cab passed below, its wheels whispering over wet cobblestones like something retreating from memory. Holmes did not turn as I entered. "You are awake earlier than usual, Watson," he remarked. "I might say the same of you," I replied. "Quite so, but I have been awake for a reason. You, I suspect, have not." I smiled at that. "And what reason might justify such an early disturbance of conscience?" Holmes tapped the bowl of his pipe thoughtfully against the window ledge. "A man is sitting in a locked room on Montague Street. He has been sitting there for 5 days. He refuses food unless it is placed at the door. He speaks to no one. And yet," here Holmes turned slightly, his grey eyes suddenly sharper, "he is not imprisoned." That remark, delivered so casually, immediately arrested my attention. "Not imprisoned?" I echoed. "Precisely. The door is unlocked. The window opens freely. He may leave at any moment. And yet he does not?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. "That, my dear Watson, is the problem Scotland Yard has just failed to solve." At that moment there came a sharp knock at our door. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps hurried along the passage, and before she could announce the visitor, the door swung open and Inspector Lestrade stepped inside, stamping the damp from his boots and looking as though he had not slept in several nights. "Holmes," he said at once, "I need you." Holmes gestured toward the armchair opposite him. "You always do, Inspector. Pray sit down before you collapse out of principle." Lestrade did not sit immediately. His gaze moved quickly about the room as if expecting to find clues already arranged for his convenience. "It's the Montague Street case," he said. "The gentleman in the locked room. We've tried everything: persuasion, observation, even forced entry under legal warrant." "And—" Holmes prompted. "And nothing changes. He remains seated at the far end of his room, facing the window. He does not acknowledge us. The strangest part is there is no sign of distress, no madness, no delirium. Just—" Holmes leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled. "Has anyone spoken to him directly?" "Yes. He answers nothing." "Has anyone attempted to enter the room while he is present?" Lestrade hesitated. "Yes. He does not resist. He simply watches." "Ah," said Holmes softly. That single syllable carried more weight than Lestrade's entire report. I confess I felt a small stirring of unease. Holmes rarely responded to confusion with such immediate interest unless something beneath the surface had already caught his attention. "And what do you make of it?" Lestrade asked impatiently. Holmes rose and walked to the mantelpiece, where he selected a small magnifying glass, though there was nothing in the room requiring examination. It was a habit of his when thoughts began to accelerate. "I make," he said slowly, "of it the possibility that your prisoner is the least imprisoned man in London." Lestrade frowned. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Holmes turned slightly. "Tell me, Inspector, what is the one thing more powerful than a locked door?" Lestrade hesitated. "A stronger lock?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Belief." For a moment there was silence in the room. I watched Lestrade carefully. I could see the thoughts struggling within him like a man trying to lift a weight beyond his strength. Holmes, meanwhile, was already moving toward the door. "Watson," he said over his shoulder, "bring your coat. We are going to Montague Street." Lestrade blinked. "Now?" "Now," Holmes replied. "Before the man in the room decides to do something that will complicate matters unnecessarily." The journey through London was one I shall not soon forget. The fog had thickened, swallowing entire streets in shifting curtains of grey. Gas lamps flickered like dying embers suspended in air rather than fixed to iron posts. Every sound seemed softened, distant, as though the city itself were speaking from under water. Holmes sat opposite me in the cab, silent, his eyes fixed upon something only he could perceive. Lestrade rode with us, visibly uneasy, glancing out at the passing buildings as though expecting them to rearrange themselves into something more intelligible. At last we arrived at Montague Street. The house in question was narrow and unremarkable, a lodging-house of the middle class, neither prosperous nor destitute. Yet there was something about it that felt disturbed. Not damaged, not altered, but subtly wrong, like a musical note played slightly off-key. We were met at the entrance by the landlady, a nervous woman whose hands trembled as she led us upstairs. "He hasn't moved, gentlemen," she whispered. "Not once. I listen at the door sometimes. I hear nothing." Holmes said nothing in reply. He simply continued upward. At the third floor we stopped before a plain wooden door. "Inside," Lestrade said quietly, "is Mr. Adrian Gray, a civil servant, quiet, respectable, no history of illness or instability." Holmes raised his hand slightly. "Before we enter," he said, "I should like to observe something." He stepped forward and examined the door frame carefully, his fingers tracing the edges where wood met plaster. Then he knelt, inspecting the carpet with intense concentration. After a full minute he rose. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the door itself. "Inspector," he said, "you mentioned the window? It opens onto the back alley. It is not barred, and yet he does not leave." Holmes nodded slowly, as though confirming an internal hypothesis. Then, without warning, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. We stepped inside. The room was sparsely furnished. A bed, a chair, a writing desk, and a small coal stove. At the far end sat a man. He was perfectly still. His back was straight, his hands resting neatly upon his knees. His face was turned toward the window, which stood slightly ajar, allowing a thin stream of fog to drift into the room like breath from some sleeping giant outside. He did not move as we entered. Holmes did not speak. Neither did I. Even Lestrade seemed struck into silence. Then, after a long moment, Holmes walked slowly across the room. "Mr. Gray," he said quietly. No response. Holmes stepped closer. "Mr. Gray, I believe you are not alone in this room." Still nothing. And then something I shall never forget. Holmes smiled. Not the smile of amusement, nor of triumph, but something colder. Something almost like recognition. "Watson," he said softly, without turning, "I believe we have arrived precisely in time." And at that moment the window behind Mr. Gray clicked shut. For a brief instant after that sound, the soft, deliberate click of the window latch, he confessed, I felt something very close to disbelief. Not fear, not yet, but that uneasy sensation which arises when the familiar laws of cause and effect appear to hesitate before continuing their duties. The window had closed. Not by wind, for there was none that morning. Not by hand, for Mr. Adrian Gray had not moved, and certainly not by accident, for the motion had been too precise, too final, like the closing of a verdict. Holmes, however, showed no surprise. Indeed, his expression suggested that the event had merely confirmed something already concluded in his mind. Lestrade, on the other hand, stepped forward immediately. "That's impossible," he said sharply. "I saw that window myself an hour ago. It was propped open. No one entered this room except us just now." Holmes did not turn. "Inspector," he said calmly, "you are assuming that because no one entered, nothing entered." "That's the same thing," Lestrade replied. "Only if one assumes," Holmes said. "That entry requires a door." At this I glanced instinctively toward the window. It was now firmly shut, the latch properly secured. The fog outside pressed against the glass like a pale, featureless face. Mr. Gray remained seated, still motionless, still silent. Yet something in the room had changed. I cannot even now precisely define what that change was. It was not visual nor auditory. It was rather a shift in presence, as though the room had subtly rearranged its expectations of itself. Holmes stepped forward and examined the window frame with renewed attention. His fingers traced the lower sill, then the latch, then the narrow gap between sash and wood. "Watson," he said without looking at me, "what do you observe about this window?" I approached and complied. "It appears ordinary," I said after a moment. "A standard sash window. No visible signs of tampering." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and yet it has performed an extraordinary action." He tapped lightly upon the glass. It closed itself. Lestrade let out a short, humorless laugh. "Holmes, you cannot seriously suggest—" "I suggest nothing," Holmes interrupted quietly. "I observe." "Suggestion is for those who lack evidence." That silenced the inspector. Holmes turned away from the window and walked slowly toward Mr. Gray. As he did so, I noticed something I had not at first observed. The man's eyes. They were open. Not wide with alarm, not fixed in trance, but open in a manner that suggested full awareness of everything occurring around him. Yet he did not acknowledge us. His gaze remained locked upon the new closed window. Holmes stopped a few feet behind him. "Mr. Gray," he said gently, "you are aware of our presence." No reply. Holmes tilted his head slightly, as though listening to a faint sound. "Yes," he murmured, "you are aware. You simply choose not to respond." Lestrade stepped forward. "We should remove him," he said. "This is wasting time." Holmes raised a hand without turning. "No," he said quietly. "One word." Yet it carried such authority that Lestrade stopped at once. Holmes continued to observe Mr. Gray for several seconds. Then he turned and looked toward the desk. It was bare except for a single object, a small brass key. Holmes approached it immediately. This, I must say, was the first truly curious element of the room. A key with no visible lock. It lay precisely in the center of the desk, as though placed with deliberate intention. Holmes picked it up. A faint scratch mark ran along its shaft. He examined it closely. "Watson," he said, "what would you infer from this?" "That it is frequently used," I replied. "Correct, and yet there is no corresponding lock in the room." Lestrade frowned. "It could belong to something outside the room." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, "and that is precisely the question." He placed the key back on the desk with great care. Then, unexpectedly, he turned once again toward Mr. Gray. "You are not imprisoned," Holmes said softly. At this, for the first time, Mr. Gray moved. It was not much a slight shift of the head, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakable. Lestrade saw it too. "He moved!" he exclaimed. Holmes did not react. Instead, he stepped closer. "You are not imprisoned," he repeated. "You are waiting." Mr. Gray's lips parted slightly. No words emerged, but something else occurred. The window, now shut and locked, faintly rattled. Twice, then stopped. I felt Lestrade stiffen beside me. "That window again," he muttered. Holmes raised his eyes toward it. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is still listening." That sentence, delivered without emphasis, produced a strange effect upon the room. Even I felt an unsettling impression that the window was not an object, but an observer. Holmes turned back to Mr. Gray. "Tell me," he said, "what happens if you leave this room?" Then, at last, a voice. It was hoarse, unused, as though dragged from deep within disuse. "I cannot—" Lestrade stepped forward at once. "Why not? The door is open. The window is open." But Holmes raised his hand again. "Let him speak," he said. Mr. Gray did not look at us. His eyes remained fixed on the window. "If I leave," he said slowly, "it closes again." A pause. Holmes nodded slightly, as though this answer had been anticipated. "And if it closes?" Holmes asked. A longer silence followed. Then Mr. Gray said very quietly, "Then it begins." At that moment I felt a distinct chill pass through the room. Lestrade looked at me sharply, as though expecting an explanation. I had none. Holmes, however, smiled faintly. "Watson," he said, "I believe we are no longer dealing with a man who refuses to leave a room." He turned toward the window again. "We are dealing with a room that refuses to be left." Outside, the fog pressed closer, and for the first time since entering Montague Street I noticed something I cannot easily explain. The window had no reflection. I have often remarked in these memoirs that Sherlock Holmes possessed the rarest of all intellectual qualities, the ability to accept an impossible fact without allowing it to disturb the structure of his reasoning. Where another man would hesitate, question his senses, or retreat into speculation, Holmes merely incorporated the anomaly into his deductions as though it had been anticipated from the beginning. It was this quality that now revealed itself most clearly as we stood in that oppressive room on Montague Street, confronted by Mr. Adrian Gray and the window that, according to all logic, ought not to have been behaving as it did. Holmes stood very still for several moments after my last observation. I had said that the window had no reflection, and though I must confess I had spoken with hesitation, I was certain of what I had seen. The fog outside pressed against the glass, yet the glass itself did not return even the faintest impression of the room within. No reflection of Holmes, no reflection of Lestrade, no reflection of myself, and most troubling of all, no reflection of Mr. Gray. Holmes finally broke the silence. "Interesting," he said quietly. Lestrade let out a short breath of irritation. "Interesting? Holmes, the window is behaving like dash." He faltered, searching for a comparison. Holmes supplied one calmly. "Like it is not entirely part of our world," he said. The inspector frowned. "That is nonsense." "Is it?" Holmes turned slightly toward him. "Then explain why 3 trained observers agree upon the same impossible fact." Lestrade hesitated, his confidence visibly weakening. Holmes walked once more toward the window. This time, however, he did not touch it. Instead, he studied it from a short distance, his gaze moving slowly across its surface, as though reading text invisible to the rest of us. "Watson," he said without turning, "what do you observe about the glass itself?" I approached cautiously and examined it again. At first glance it appeared perfectly ordinary, clear, intact, undisturbed. Yet now that I knew to look for irregularities, I noticed something subtle. The surface did not quite behave like glass. It did not catch the light in the expected manner. Instead, it seemed to absorb it slightly, as though reluctant to return it. "I cannot explain it precisely," I said, "but it appears duller than it should be." "Precisely," Holmes replied. Lestrade shook his head. "This is absurd. It is a window, not a philosophical problem." Holmes finally turned to him. "Inspector," he said, "nearly all problems appear absurd until they are understood, at which point they become merely inevitable." He returned his attention to Mr. Gray. The man had not moved again since speaking those few words earlier, yet something about his posture had altered slightly, not in position but in tension, as though he were no longer sitting by choice, but by agreement with something unseen. Holmes stepped closer to him. "Mr. Gray," he said, "you stated that if you leave it begins. Tell me what it refers to." Mr. Gray did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed upon the window, unblinking. Then, in the same strained voice as before, "The closing." Holmes nodded once. "And when it closes?" "A pause." "It repeats." At this I felt a slight tightening in my chest. The phrase was simple, yet it carried an unsettling implication, as though the event we had witnessed was not singular, but cyclical. Holmes, however, appeared almost satisfied. "Yes," he murmured. "That would account for several inconsistencies." Lestrade looked between us both. "What inconsistencies?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the desk again and picked up the brass key. He turned it over carefully in his fingers. "This key," he said, "is not for this room." Lestrade frowned. "Then what is it for?" Holmes looked toward the window. "That," he said, "is what we must determine." He placed the key back on the desk. Then, without warning, he crossed the room and pulled the door open. A rush of colder air entered from the corridor. The fog outside the building seemed to have seeped indoors, for even the hallway beyond appeared dimmer than it should have been. Holmes stepped into the passage and examined it briefly. Then he stopped. "Watson!" he called softly. I joined him at once. He pointed toward the floor. There, faint but visible in the dust, were footprints. Not ours. They led toward the stairwell and then stopped abruptly. "Fresh?" I asked. Holmes shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "Interrupted." He knelt and studied the final marks closely. Then he rose. "Someone," he said quietly, "left this room recently." "But not by the stairs." Lestrade joined us, peering over his shoulder. "How else could they have left?" he demanded. Holmes did not reply immediately. Instead, he looked back into the room where Mr. Gray still sat. After a moment he said, "There are only 2 possibilities. Either someone entered through the window, or the window has been functioning as something other than a window." He returned to the room and closed the door behind us. The moment it shut, I felt something change again. A faint sound, barely perceptible, came from the glass. A click, not loud, not dramatic. Holmes turned sharply toward it. The window had locked itself from the inside. Lestrade swore under his breath, but Holmes only smiled faintly. "I see," he said. Then he added, almost to himself, "So it has begun again." And at that exact moment Mr. Gray finally turned his head away from the window and looked directly at Sherlock Holmes. It is a curious truth that in most cases of crime, or what is assumed to be crime, the first reliable fracture in understanding does not come from evidence, but from resistance. Not resistance of the criminal, nor even of the victim, but resistance of reality itself, as interpreted by those who insist it must behave in a reasonable manner. In the Montague Street room that resistance now took a human form. "Mr. Adrian." Gray had finally turned his head. It was a slow movement, deliberate rather than sudden, as though each degree of motion required permission from something unseen. When his eyes met those of Sherlock Holmes, I saw no madness in them, no delirium, no fevered imagination. Instead, there was something far more disquieting. recognition mixed with reluctance, as though Holmes were an interruption in a conversation already in progress. Holmes did not speak immediately. He simply observed. Lestrade, however, could not restrain himself. "Gray," he exclaimed, "you will answer us at once. Do you understand who we are?" The man did not respond to him at all. His attention remained fixed upon Holmes. Then, in a voice that was quieter than before, but clearer in its intent, he said, "You are not supposed to be here yet." A silence followed that statement, an unnaturally complete silence, as though even the dust in the air had paused to listen. Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And yet," he said calmly, "here I am." Mr. Gray's gaze flickered briefly toward the window behind him, then returned to Holmes. "It will notice," he said. Lestrade stepped forward. "What will notice?" "You are speaking nonsense." Holmes raised a hand, not to silence Lestrade this time, but to hold him in place. "Let him continue," Holmes said softly. Mr. Gray swallowed once, visibly struggling with something internal. "The window does not close by itself," he said. Holmes nodded faintly. "I am aware." At this, I must confess, I glanced involuntarily toward the window myself. It stood as it had before shut, locked, perfectly ordinary in appearance. Yet I could not now look at it without feeling that it was attentive in some manner. Mr. Gray continued, "It closes when it is observed incorrectly." Lestrade let out a short laugh of disbelief. "Observed incorrectly? This is madness." Holmes did not agree, nor did he disagree. Instead, he stepped closer to Gray. "Define incorrectly," he said. Gray hesitated. Then, in a lower voice, "When someone leaves the room without completing the cycle." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what is the cycle?" Mr. Gray did not answer immediately. His fingers tightened slightly upon his knees, as though resisting some internal pressure. Then he said, "Open. Wait. Repeat. A pause. Always repeat." At this, Holmes turned slightly toward the window. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you notice anything about his phrasing?" I considered the question carefully. "It is mechanical," I said. "Almost ritualistic." "Precisely," Holmes replied. He turned back to Gray. "And how long have you been in this state?" Gray blinked slowly. "I do not remember beginning," he said. "Only continuing." Lestrade shook his head again. "This is clearly psychological. The man is unwell. We should remove him at once." Holmes finally turned his gaze fully upon the inspector. "Remove him?" he said. "Yes," Lestrade insisted. "Take him to a physician. End this nonsense." Holmes smiled faintly. "And if removal is part of the cycle?" That question struck Lestrade into silence. Holmes walked slowly toward the desk again, picking up the brass key for a second time. He held it up between his fingers. "This object," he said, "is not merely symbolic. It is functional." Gray reacted immediately. "No," he said sharply. It was the first time he had spoken with urgency. Holmes looked at him. "You recognize it," Holmes said. Gray's gaze dropped momentarily, then returned to the window. "It is not for you," he said. Holmes considered this. "Then for whom is it intended?" Gray did not answer. Instead, something very subtle occurred. The window rattled. Once, very softly, yet unmistakably. Lestrade stepped back instinctively. "Did you hear that?" Holmes nodded once. "Yes," he said. "It is becoming aware of variation." I confess I felt a chill at those words. The idea that an inanimate object, or what should have been an inanimate object, could exhibit something akin to awareness was deeply unsettling. Holmes returned the key to the desk with great care. Then he turned suddenly toward the door. "We are leaving," he said. Lestrade stared at him. "Leaving?" "Holmes, we have barely begun." Holmes opened the door. "Precisely," he said. "And I prefer to begin again from a position of advantage." He stepped into the corridor. I followed at once. Lestrade hesitated only briefly before joining us, but as I exited the room I glanced back. Mr. Gray had returned his gaze to the window, and the window, though still closed, appeared, if I may use such a term, to be waiting. Once in the corridor, Lestrade immediately rounded on Holmes. "You cannot simply abandon the investigation," he said angrily. "The man is clearly disturbed. The case is simple." Holmes adjusted his coat sleeves calmly. "No," he said, "the case is not simple. It is only familiar." Lestrade frowned. "Familiar?" Holmes began walking slowly down the stairs. "Yes," he said. "We are dealing with a pattern that repeats itself until interrupted correctly." I followed closely behind him. "And have you seen such a pattern before?" I asked. Holmes paused at the landing. "Not precisely," he said, "but I have seen variations of it." He looked upward toward the closed room above us. "Systems that respond to observation," he added quietly. Lestrade's scoff. "Systems? It is a man in a room, Holmes, not a scientific experiment." Holmes turned slightly toward him. "That," he said, "is precisely what makes it dangerous." At the bottom of the stairwell Holmes stopped. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in a quieter tone, "There is something else in that room." Lestrade frowned. "Besides Gray?" Holmes nodded once. "And what is it?" Holmes looked upward again. "The thing that taught him the cycle." A silence followed. Even Lestrade did not immediately respond. Finally Holmes stepped toward the exit. "Come, Watson," he said. "We must examine Montague Street from a different perspective." "And Gray?" I asked. Holmes paused at the door. Without turning, he said, "He will remain exactly where he is until the window decides otherwise." And with that unsettling remark he stepped into the foggy London street, leaving behind a room that, even in our absence, did not feel empty. The fog outside Montague Street had thickened considerably by the time we reached the pavement again, as though the city itself were attempting to conceal what we had just witnessed. Gas lamps burned dimly within their halos of mist, and the passing of a solitary carriage sounded unnaturally distant, as though it belonged to another world only faintly overlapping our own. Inspector Lestrade, still clearly unsettled by Holmes's abrupt departure from the room, walked ahead of us in irritated silence. Every few steps he would glance back, as though expecting Holmes to reverse his decision at the last moment, and return upstairs to resolve matters in the manner Scotland Yard preferred quickly, neatly, and preferably without philosophical complications. Holmes, however, appeared entirely at ease. He walked with his usual measured pace, hands clasped behind his back, eyes half lowered yet constantly observing. I had long learned that this posture did not indicate relaxation, but rather a heightened state of mental activity. He was not absent-minded, he was elsewhere entirely, engaged in deductions too rapid and layered to be expressed in ordinary speech. At last Lestrade could contain himself no longer. "Well," he demanded, "are you going to explain what you just saw in there, or are we to continue wandering about London like lost philosophers?" Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he stopped beneath a gas lamp and looked up at it thoughtfully, as though the question had been addressed to the flame itself. Then he said quietly, "What I saw, Inspector, is not yet something I am prepared to explain." Lestrade let out a sharp sound of frustration. "Not prepared? Holmes, a man is sitting in a locked loop of nonsense, and you tell me you are not prepared?" Holmes turned his gaze toward him. "Yes," he said simply. The inspector blinked. "Why not?" Holmes resumed walking. "Because," he said, "explanation at this stage would contaminate observation." I confess I exchanged a brief glance with Lestrade at that remark. It was not unusual for Holmes to withhold conclusions, but it was rare for him to acknowledge the act so openly. We continued along the street for some time in silence before Holmes finally spoke again. "Watson," he said, without turning, "did you notice the direction of Gray's gaze?" "Yes," I replied. "Always toward the window." "And nothing else?" I considered carefully. "Nothing else of significance." Holmes nodded faintly. "That," he said, "is incorrect." Lestrade snorted. "Of course it is." Holmes ignored him. "There was a moment," Holmes continued, "before the window locked itself, when Gray looked elsewhere." I frowned. "I do not recall that." "No," Holmes agreed. "You would not." That answer alone was enough to make me attentive. We turned into a narrower side street where the fog seemed denser still, clinging to the brickwork like damp wool. Holmes stopped again. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small notebook. I observed that he had not taken it out while inside the room, nor immediately after leaving it. He opened it now with deliberate care. Lestrade leaned forward impatiently. "Notes? Now?" Holmes flipped through several pages before stopping. "Yes," he said. "Now is precisely the correct time." He held the notebook up slightly. "Before we entered the room, I observed something on the stairwell." Lestrade frowned. "You observed many things." "True," Holmes said, "but only one of them was inconsistent." He turned the notebook toward us. There, in neat, precise handwriting, was a single line. "Dust displacement on step 3. Inward pattern interrupted." Lestrade squinted at it. "What on earth does that mean?" Holmes closed the notebook. "It means," he said, "that someone exited the room before we arrived." Lestrade shook his head. "You already said that." "Yes," Holmes replied, "but I did not say how." A pause. Then Holmes added, "And more importantly, I did not say what exited with them." I felt a slight tightening in my chest. Lestrade, however, merely looked confused. "What are you suggesting?" "That Gray left earlier and returned." Holmes shook his head once. "No," he said. "Gray has not left that room." He looked up toward the fog. "But something else has." We stood there for a moment, the weight of that statement settling uneasily between us. Then Lestrade said, more quietly now, "Holmes, what exactly are we dealing with?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the street itself. "Watson," he said, "when we entered Montague Street, did you notice anything unusual about the house opposite Gray's lodging?" I thought back carefully. "It appeared unoccupied," I said. "Curtains drawn. No movement." "Correct," Holmes replied. "And now?" he asked. We both looked. At first I saw nothing different. Then, gradually, I noticed it. A curtain just one had shifted, not drawn aside, not opened, as though something behind it had adjusted its position very slightly. Lestrade stiffened. "Someone's watching us." Holmes shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "That is the mistake you are making." He turned toward us. "You assume observation requires intent." A pause. "But in certain systems," Holmes continued, "observation is automatic." I felt a faint unease at the precision of his phrasing. Lestrade, however, was less patient. "Holmes," he said sharply, "if you know something, you must say it. We cannot proceed blindly." For a moment Holmes said nothing. Then he stepped closer to Lestrade and lowered his voice slightly. "I know," he said, "that the window is not merely an object." Lestrade frowned. "You already said that." Holmes nodded. "But I did not yet say what it behaves like." A silence followed. Then Holmes said, "It behaves like a rule." I saw Lestrade's expression change at that confusion, giving way to something more cautious. "A rule?" he repeated. "Yes," Holmes said. "A condition that enforces repetition when violated." He turned slightly. "And Gray is not the cause of it. He is the participant." I asked quietly, "And what happens if the rule is broken?" Holmes looked at me for a moment. Then he said very calmly, "We are about to find out." And with that, he began walking again back toward Montague Street, leaving us with the uncomfortable realization that Holmes had not yet told us the most important detail of all. Whatever was happening in that room, he already understood how it ended. We returned to Montague Street under a heavier sky than before, though whether this was due to the thickening fog or some alteration in my own perception, I could not say. The street seemed quieter now, as though it had learned of our presence and was deliberately withholding its usual sounds in anticipation of what was to come. Inspector Lestrade walked faster than either Holmes or myself, his earlier irritation now replaced by a restless urgency. I had seen him in many moods during our cases together, but I could not recall a time when he appeared so unsettled by something he could not classify. He was a man who believed in categories crime or accident, guilt or innocence, solved or unsolved, and Montague Street offered him none of these comforts. Holmes, by contrast, appeared even more composed than before. If anything, there was a subtle sharpening in his manner, as though some internal calculation had recently resolved itself into clearer form. He said nothing as we re-entered the house, but I observed that his eyes moved more deliberately now, resting on details that had previously escaped even his attention. We climbed the stairs once more. The landlady, upon seeing us return, seemed both relieved and anxious. "He hasn't moved," she whispered again, as though repetition might somehow reinforce the truth of it. Holmes did not pause. "I would be surprised if he had," he replied. At the third-floor landing, Lestrade hesitated for the first time. "I do not like this," he muttered. "No," Holmes said quietly. "You are beginning to understand it." That did not reassure him. Holmes opened the door. We stepped inside. The room was unchanged in appearance, yet the atmosphere within it had altered in a way that defies precise description. It was not darker, nor colder, nor even more silent, but it felt as though the room had adjusted its expectations of us during our absence. Mr. Adrian. Gray still sat in the same position, facing the window. But now there was something else, a faint mark upon the glass. Lestrade noticed it first. "What is that?" he demanded. Holmes moved closer without answering. It was a thin, vertical smear, barely visible unless light struck it at a precise angle. It ran from the upper portion of the window down toward the latch, as though something had traced it from outside. I leaned in. "It looks like condensation," I suggested. Holmes shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "Condensation does not choose direction." He examined it more closely, then turned his attention to Mr. Gray. "You are alone," Holmes said. Gray did not respond immediately. Then, in a quiet voice, "No." Lestrade stepped forward sharply. "There was someone else in here?" Gray hesitated. "Not someone. A pause." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then what?" he asked. Gray's gaze remained fixed on the window. "It does not leave," he said. At that exact moment a sound came from above us. A single distinct thud. All three of us reacted instinctively. Lestrade looked upward immediately. "What was that?" he demanded. Holmes, however, did not look up. Instead he looked at the window. "Watson," he said quietly, "did you hear the timing of that sound?" "It came immediately after Gray spoke," I said. Holmes nodded once. "Yes," he said. "Not before. Not during." Lestrade frowned. "That proves nothing." Holmes turned slightly toward him. "It proves correlation," he said, "which is often the first visible symptom of structure." Another sound came, this time sharper. A scrape. From above. Lestrade moved toward the door instinctively. "There is someone upstairs." Holmes stopped him with a single glance. "No," he said. Then more quietly, "There is something continuing upstairs." At this, even Lestrade hesitated. Mr. Gray shifted slightly for the first time since our return. Not turning away from the window, but adjusting his posture, an almost imperceptible tightening of the shoulders. Holmes noticed it immediately. "You hear it as well," Holmes said to him. Gray did not deny it. Another sound followed, this time like something sliding across wood. Holmes turned toward the window again. "Watson," he said, "what do you recall about the first time we heard the window close?" I replied at once. It was silent except for the latch. "Yes," Holmes said. "And what did we assume that implied?" "That it was closing normally," I said. Holmes nodded. "And now?" Before I could answer, Lestrade interrupted. "For heaven's sake, Holmes, stop speaking in riddles. There is someone above us, likely an accomplice. We should investigate." He moved toward the door again. Holmes allowed him to reach it, then said quietly, "If you open that door, Inspector, you will confirm the cycle." Lestrade paused. "What cycle?" Holmes stepped closer to the window. "The one Mr. Gray is already trapped inside." A silence followed. Then Gray spoke again. "They went upstairs." Lestrade turned sharply. "Who went upstairs?" Gray did not answer directly. "After the second closing." Holmes finally looked at him fully. "There has been more than one closing," he said. Gray nodded once. Lestrade looked between them. "This is nonsense. We have been here for only minutes." Holmes corrected him gently. "You have been here for one iteration," he said. That word iteration seemed to disturb Lestrade more than anything else so far. Holmes continued, "Mr. Gray, how many times has the window closed?" Gray hesitated. "Too many." A faint tremor passed through his voice. Holmes turned toward the window once more. "And each time," Holmes said softly, "something changes upstairs." Another sound came, this time unmistakably heavier. Above us, Lestrade drew a sharp breath, but Holmes remained perfectly still. "Yes," Holmes murmured, "it is progressing." I felt a tightening sensation in my chest that I cannot fully explain. The idea that something was repeating, building, accumulating above us outside of visible sequence was deeply unsettling. Holmes turned suddenly to me. "Watson," he said, "we must determine not what is in the room." A pause. "But what is in the interval between rooms?" At that moment the window behind Mr. Gray clicked softly, once, and locked itself again. The sound of the window locking itself behind Mr. Adrian Gray was no longer by this point an event capable of startling us in the ordinary sense. Rather, it had become a kind of punctuation and indication that whatever unseen mechanism governed this affair had advanced one step further along its course. Yet I observed that Inspector Lestrade had not yet adapted to this new reality. His reaction remained that of a man attempting to impose conventional logic upon an unconventional machine. Each new occurrence seemed to him not a continuation but an interruption of reason. Holmes, however, appeared to be measuring something far more precise. He stood motionless for several seconds after the latch clicked, his attention fixed not on the window itself, but on the timing of it. I had seen him do this before, treating sound, not substance, as the primary source of evidence. Then he spoke. "It is accelerating," he said quietly. Lestrade turned sharply. "What is accelerating?" Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he walked slowly toward the center of the room, his gaze moving between Gray and the window as though tracking an invisible line connecting the two. "The interval," Holmes said at last. I frowned. "The interval between what?" Holmes turned slightly toward me. "Between repetition and recognition." That explanation, while characteristically precise, offered little comfort to Lestrade. "Holmes," he said impatiently, "we are wasting time. There is a disturbance upstairs, a disturbed man in this room, and an increasingly bizarre claim that a window behaves as though it has intent. If there is a culprit, I intend to find them." Holmes regarded him calmly. "You already have a culprit," he said. Lestrade blinked. "Gray?" Holmes shook his head. "No." A pause followed. Lestrade's frustration deepened. "Then who?" Holmes stepped closer to the desk and picked up the brass key once more. He did not examine it this time. He simply held it, as though its weight alone was sufficient information. "The suspect," Holmes said, "is not present in the room." Lestrade frowned. "Then how can it be a suspect?" Holmes looked toward the window. "Because it does not require presence," he said. At that moment Mr. Gray spoke again, his voice lower than before, strained in a manner that suggested repetition had begun to erode his composure. "It chooses who notices it," Gray said. Lestrade scoffed. "This is meaningless." Holmes did not correct him. Instead he asked Gray directly, "And who did it choose before us?" Gray hesitated. "The first observer." A silence followed that answer. Holmes's expression did not change, but I noticed a subtle narrowing of his eyes. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you recall any mention of a first observer prior to our arrival?" I thought carefully. "No," I replied. "None." Holmes nodded once. "Exactly." He placed the key back down on the desk. Then he turned toward the window again. Lestrade, increasingly frustrated, stepped forward. "This is absurd," he said. "We are constructing meaning out of vague statements from a disturbed man. There is no evidence of any observer. There is no evidence of anything beyond a peculiar psychological condition." Holmes looked at him calmly. "And yet," he said, "you are standing in a room where an object performs a function without mechanism." Lestrade opened his mouth, then closed it again. Holmes continued. "Tell me, Inspector," he said, "if this were psychological, whose mind would be responsible?" Lestrade hesitated. "Gray's, obviously." Holmes nodded. "Then explain why the room reacts when Gray is not speaking." Before Lestrade could answer, a faint sound emerged again from above. A single step, then another, measured, unhurried. Holmes raised a hand slightly. "Listen carefully," he said. We obeyed. The footsteps continued. Not descending, not ascending, moving. Lestrade turned toward the ceiling. "There is someone up there." Holmes shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "There is no person upstairs." Lestrade's frustration sharpened. "Then what is it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Mr. Gray. "You said there was a first observer," Holmes said. Gray nodded. Holmes stepped closer. "Was that observer inside the room?" A pause. Gray's eyes flickered briefly toward the window. "No," he said. Holmes's voice lowered slightly. "Outside?" Gray hesitated. "Not outside." Lestrade interrupted immediately. "That is contradictory." Holmes raised a hand. "On the contrary," he said calmly. "It is precise." He turned toward me briefly. "Watson, consider the possibility that observation does not require spatial presence." I frowned slightly. "Then what does it require?" Holmes answered without hesitation. "Participation." Another sound came from above, this time closer. Lestrade stepped back instinctively. "This is becoming intolerable," he muttered. Holmes, however, had stopped listening to the sound entirely. His attention had shifted to something else, the key, once again. But this time he did not touch it. Instead, he simply observed it. "I see it now," he said quietly. Lestrade frowned. "See what?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Then he said, "The suspect is not a person." A pause. "But a condition." Gray stiffened slightly at those words. Holmes turned toward him. "You are not the cause," he said to Gray. "You are the trigger." Gray closed his eyes briefly. As though this explanation was not new to him, Lestrade looked between them. "Trigger for what?" Holmes stepped closer to the window. "For repetition," he said, and then very quietly, "And repetition always requires an observer who does not leave." At that moment the window rattled once, not as before, not softly, but sharply, as though reacting. Holmes did not move. Instead he said, "There it is." Lestrade stared. "Why?" Holmes turned slightly toward us. "The suspect," he said. And for the first time since entering Montague Street I felt the distinct and troubling impression that Holmes was no longer investigating the case. He was addressing it, It is one of the most unnerving experiences in my recollection of Sherlock Holmes's cases, that moment when investigation ceases to resemble inquiry and begins to resemble conversation with something that does not willingly acknowledge the rules of discourse. After Holmes had spoken those words, "He is not the cause, he is the trigger," a change came over the room that I cannot describe as either physical or emotional. It was as though the case itself had acknowledged that it was now being examined in its correct form. Mr. Gray sat perfectly still, yet no longer with the same quality of passive endurance. There was now tension in him, like a string drawn tight and held in place only by habit. The window, though closed and locked, seemed less like an object and more like a boundary that was aware of being approached. Inspector Lestrade, however, remained rooted in the older world of interpretation. "This is becoming intolerable," he muttered again. "Holmes, if you believe there is some theory here, then explain it plainly. Otherwise I shall remove Gray to Scotland Yard myself and end this farce." Holmes did not look at him. "That," he said quietly, "would be the most dangerous action available to you." Lestrade stiffened. "Dangerous? He is a harmless civil servant." Holmes finally turned. "No," he said. "He is the last stable position in a moving system." That phrase, though obscure, had the effect of silencing even Lestrade for a moment. Holmes walked slowly to the center of the room. His gaze moved once again to the window, then to Gray, then briefly to the ceiling. Then he said, "We are going to perform an experiment." Lestrade frowned immediately. "An experiment?" Holmes nodded. "What kind of experiment?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he removed his pocket-watch and placed it on the desk beside the brass key. I noticed then something unusual. He did not open the watch, nor consult it. He simply placed it down as though marking a position. "Watson," he said, "stand near the door." I obeyed at once, though I confess I did so with a growing sense of unease. Lestrade remained where he was, watching Holmes suspiciously. Holmes continued, "Inspector, you will remain where you are." "And Gray?" Lestrade asked. Holmes looked at Gray for a long moment. "He will remain seated." Gray did not object. Holmes stepped closer to the window. Then, without warning, he spoke in a very calm voice. "Open." Nothing happened. Lestrade scoffed. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" Holmes raised a hand slightly. "Patience," he said. He turned toward Gray. "Mr. Gray," he said, "I am going to ask you to do something that you have not done since the cycle began." Gray looked up slowly. Holmes continued, "When I say the word, you will leave the room." A silence fell instantly. Lestrade reacted at once. "No!" "That is exactly what we should not do." Holmes interrupted him sharply. "Inspector, do not interfere." It was not shouted. It did not need to be. Lestrade stopped mid-sentence. Holmes returned his attention to Gray. "You will leave the room," he repeated, "and you will not look at the window." Gray's expression tightened. "No," he said quietly. Holmes nodded slightly, as though this refusal confirmed something expected. "Then we modify the condition," he said. He walked to the desk and picked up the brass key. "This object," Holmes said, "is the anchor." Gray reacted instantly. "No," he said again, sharper this time. Holmes observed him carefully. "Watson," Holmes said without looking at me, "do you see the pattern of resistance?" I studied Gray. "Yes," I said. "He reacts strongly to the key." Holmes nodded. "Because the key is not symbolic," he said. "It is procedural." Lestrade stepped forward slightly. "Procedural." Holmes continued. "It defines the state change." At this, Gray suddenly spoke faster than before. "If it is moved," he said, "it resets." Holmes looked at him sharply. "Resets what?" Gray hesitated. "The window." A silence followed that answer. Holmes turned slowly toward the window. "And what happens after reset?" he asked. Gray did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the floor. "It chooses again." Holmes exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he murmured. "That explains the accumulation." Lestrade frowned. "Accumulation of what?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he placed the key on the window-sill. Instantly, Gray stood up. It was sudden, involuntary. "No," Gray said sharply. Holmes did not react to the warning. He simply stepped back. At that moment the window gave a faint sound, a soft internal click. Not locking, not unlocking, changing state. Lestrade stepped back instinctively. "Holmes, what have you done?" Holmes did not look at him. "Watson," he said calmly, "observe Gray." I did. Gray was trembling slightly now, eyes fixed not on Holmes, not on Lestrade, but on the window. And then a sound from above, louder than before, a clear, deliberate step. Holmes raised his head. "Yes," he said quietly. "It acknowledges external perturbation." Lestrade looked panicked now. "Holmes, we need to stop this immediately." Holmes finally turned toward him. "No," he said. A pause. Now we observe the response. He stepped slightly aside, clearing the space between Gray and the window. Gray took one step backward. The window rattled, then stopped. And for the first time since we had entered Montague Street, I saw something that chilled me more than anything yet. The window was no longer merely reacting. It was deciding. There are moments in inquiry when the mind, having pursued a problem with sufficient rigor, reaches a point where explanation ceases to be an exercise of intellect and becomes instead an act of confrontation. It is at such moments that Sherlock Holmes, as I have often observed, no longer merely investigates, he compels resolution. What had begun in that modest room on Montague Street had now reached such a stage. "Mr. Adrian." Gray stood between us and the window, trembling slightly, his earlier passivity replaced by a strained alertness. The brass key, now placed upon the window sill by Holmes, seemed to occupy not merely a physical position, but a functional one like a lever within an unseen mechanism. Inspector Lestrade, meanwhile, had abandoned all pretense of composure. "Holmes," he said sharply, "this has gone far enough. You are provoking something you do not understand." Holmes did not look at him. "I understand it," he said quietly. Lestrade hesitated. "Then explain it." Holmes turned slightly. "Not yet," he said. That single word, "not yet," carried an authority that silenced even Lestrade's protest. Holmes walked slowly toward the center of the room. Then he spoke in a measured tone. "We are now approaching the convergence." I frowned. Holmes nodded. "The point at which all iterations align into a single observable outcome." Lestrade looked at me as though seeking confirmation that this was madness. I had none to offer. At that moment Mr. Gray spoke again. "It is aware," he said softly. Holmes turned immediately. "What is aware?" he asked. Gray did not answer directly. Instead he said, "All of it." A silence followed. Then from above us came a sound unlike those before it. Not a step, not a scrape, but several movements occurring in sequence too closely aligned to be accidental. Holmes raised his hand. "Now," he said quietly, "it has begun synchronization." Lestrade stepped back. "Synchronization with what?" Holmes finally looked at him. "With observation," he said. At that moment I felt a distinct unease, not fear exactly, but the sense that attention itself had become a force capable of altering events. Holmes turned toward the window. "Watson," he said, "what do you observe about the key's position?" I looked. "It has not moved," I replied. Holmes nodded. "Correct," he said. Then he added, "Yet everything else has adjusted around it." Lestrade frowned. "That is absurd." Holmes did not respond. Instead, he walked slowly toward the desk and retrieved his pocket watch once more. He opened it this time, then closed it. "Time is no longer continuous in this room," he said. Lestrade stared. "That is ridiculous." Holmes turned. "Is it?" he said calmly. "Then explain why the same sound occurs before identical events." Before Lestrade could answer, a loud knock came from above. This time it was not subtle. It was deliberate. Gray flinched. Lestrade moved toward the door instinctively. "There is someone upstairs," he said again. Holmes stopped him without touching him. "No," he said. Then he corrected himself. "There's a response upstairs." Lestrade looked furious. "That is the same thing." Holmes shook his head. "No," he said. "A person acts. A response follows pattern." He turned toward Gray. "Mr. Gray," Holmes said, "you said earlier that it chooses who notices it." Gray nodded slowly. Holmes stepped closer. "Who noticed it first?" Gray hesitated. "The one who stayed after the first closing." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And where is that observer now?" Gray did not answer immediately. Then, very quietly, "Not in sequence," Lestrade interrupted sharply. "This is nonsense again." Holmes ignored him. Instead he walked toward the window. The brass key still rested upon the sill. Holmes studied it carefully. Then he said, "We are no longer dealing with a single room." A pause. "We are dealing with a system distributed across repetition." At that moment the window rattled. Not once, but in a sequence. 3 distinct vibrations. Lestrade stepped back. "That is impossible." Holmes nodded. "Yes," he said, "within normal constraints." Then he added, "But not within this one." He turned toward Gray. "This is where you have been mistaken," Holmes said quietly. Gray looked up. Holmes continued. "You believe you are trapped inside the room. A pause. But you are not." Holmes gestured toward the window. "You are trapped inside the condition that defines the room's behavior." Gray's expression tightened, and then for the first time I saw something change in him. Not fear, recognition. Holmes stepped back slowly. "Now," he said, "we invite the condition to complete itself." Lestrade looked horrified. "Invite it?" Holmes did not answer him. Instead he simply said, "Everyone remain exactly where they are." And then he moved his hand away from the key. There are moments, I have often thought, when a case ceases to be an arrangement of clues and becomes instead an arrangement of consequences. In such moments, Sherlock Holmes does not pursue truth so much as he positions it like a surgeon aligning a fractured bone before it is permitted to settle into place. We had reached such a moment on Montague Street. Holmes had withdrawn his hand from the brass key. That small gesture, so simple, so unremarkable in appearance, altered the entire atmosphere of the room. It was not that anything visibly changed at once, but rather that everything seemed to pause, as though awaiting permission to proceed. "Mr. Adrian." Gray stood rigidly between us and the window. His eyes were no longer fixed on a single point. Instead, they shifted subtly, as though tracking something not confined to physical space. Inspector Lestrade, pale now with irritation and unease, whispered harshly, "Holmes, what have you done?" Holmes did not look at him. "I have removed interference," he said quietly. Lestrade frowned. "Interference?" Holmes nodded once. "The key was anchoring a state that is no longer required for observation." That explanation, if it can be called such, seemed only to deepen Lestrade's confusion. At that moment Mr. Gray spoke again. "This is the wrong sequence," he said. Holmes turned slightly toward him. "Wrong for whom?" he asked. Gray hesitated. "For you." A silence followed that answer. From above us came another sound, this time slower, more deliberate. A movement that suggested not intrusion, but arrival. Holmes raised his hand slightly. "Yes," he murmured. "It is a lining." Lestrade stepped forward. "Holmes, I insist you tell me what is happening." Holmes finally turned toward him. "Inspector," he said calmly, "you are witnessing a system correcting observational error." Lestrade stared at him. "Observational error?" Holmes nodded. "The room has been repeating until the correct observer participates in the correct manner." I frowned. "And who is the correct observer?" Holmes paused, then said quietly, "All of us." At that moment the window gave a faint sound, not a rattle, not a click, but something deeper like pressure shifting within glass. Mr. Gray visibly stiffened. "No," he said suddenly. Holmes turned toward him immediately. "You recognize this state?" Holmes said. Gray shook his head slightly. "It is not supposed to reach this point," he said. Holmes stepped closer. "And yet it has." Gray's voice lowered. "Because the observer changed." Lestrade frowned. "What observer?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window. Then he said, "The one who understands the cycle." A pause. Lestrade turned sharply toward him. "And who is that?" Holmes remained silent for a moment longer than usual. Then he said, "I am." At that exact instant something changed, not in the room, but in its behavior. The window did not rattle this time. It responded. A soft, precise movement occurred within the latch mechanism itself, as though something unseen had tested its structure. Gray took a step backward. "No," he whispered again. Holmes raised a hand slightly. "Watson," he said calmly, "observe carefully." I did. The air in the room seemed divided, not physically, but perceptually. It was as though the space between objects had become structured, segmented by invisible rules. Lestrade looked increasingly alarmed. "This is absurd," he said again, but his voice lacked conviction now. Holmes walked slowly toward the window. He did not touch it. Instead he stood directly before it, and spoke. "You have repeated this condition sufficiently." A pause. "I am now observing without interruption." At that moment Mr. Gray suddenly spoke with unexpected urgency. "Stop!" Holmes turned slightly. Gray's voice was strained. "If you observe it fully," he said, "it completes." Holmes nodded. "Yes," he said, "that is the intention." Lestrade stepped forward sharply. "What intention?" Holmes did not answer him. Instead, he reached toward the brass key, not touching it, but hovering his hand above it briefly, then withdrew. "The cycle requires completion," Holmes said quietly. and completion requires a final observer state. Gray shook his head repeatedly. "No," he said, "that is not how it was before." Holmes turned toward him. "Before?" he asked. Gray hesitated. Then, very quietly, "There was always someone who failed to leave." A silence followed. Holmes's expression sharpened slightly. "And that failure," he said, "became the anchor." Gray nodded once. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said, "that explains persistence." Lestrade looked between them. "I do not understand any of this." Holmes finally turned toward him fully. "That," he said, "is because you are still assuming there is a crime." A pause. "There is not." At that moment the window made a sound unlike any before it. Not movement, not pressure, but recognition, a single clear internal shift as though something within it had acknowledged completion of condition. Gray's face went pale. "It has noticed you," he said to Holmes. Holmes nodded once. "Yes," he said. "And now," he added quietly, "it will conclude." From above us came one final sound. But this time it did not fade. It remained, present. And then the window began to open. I have often found that the most alarming moments in Sherlock Holmes's cases are not those in which violence occurs, nor even those in which truth is revealed, but those in which the ordinary structure of reality appears to hesitate, uncertain whether it is still required to continue in its usual form. When the window began to open, it was such a moment. There was no wind, no force applied by hand, no visible mechanism engaged. Yet the sash moved with a steady, deliberate inevitability, as though responding to an instruction that had existed long before the physical components of the window were ever assembled. "Mr. Adrian." Gray stepped back at once, his face now drained of all color. "No," he whispered again, though this time it sounded less like refusal and more like recognition of an unavoidable outcome. Inspector Lestrade reacted instinctively. "Holmes!" he exclaimed. "It is opening on its own." Holmes did not move. "I am aware," he said quietly. The window continued its motion, not abruptly, not violently, but precisely. A measured reopening, as though completing a gesture interrupted mid-action. And then, most unnerving of all, it stopped halfway. It did not open fully. It did not close. It held. Lestrade stared at it. "What is it doing?" Holmes stepped closer, his eyes fixed upon the gap. "It is stabilizing," he said. "Stabilizing what?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead he turned his attention to Gray. "Mr. Gray," he said calmly, "this is the point at which the cycle previously reset." Gray shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "it is not supposed to stop there." Holmes nodded once. "Yes," he replied. "That is why it is different now." At that moment a sound came from above, but it was no longer a step. It was a presence, not descending, not ascending, but arriving. Lestrade took a step backward. "There's someone up there. I am going to—" Holmes raised his hand. "No," he said firmly. Lestrade hesitated. Holmes continued, his voice lower now. "You will not find a person." A pause. "You will find only continuation." I felt a chill pass through me at that phrase. It was not its meaning that disturbed me most, but the certainty with which Holmes delivered it. The window shifted slightly again, not closing, not opening further, but adjusting, as though calibrating itself to something unseen. Gray suddenly spoke, his voice strained. "It is aware of you now." Holmes turned slightly. "Yes," he said. Gray continued. "It was never meant to be observed by someone who does not break." Lestrade frowned. "Break what?" Gray hesitated. A silence followed. Holmes stepped slowly toward the desk where the brass key still lay untouched. He did not pick it up. Instead, he looked at it as one might examine the final component of a completed equation. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "what do you recall about the first state Gray described?" I thought carefully. "Open weight close," I said. "Repeat." Holmes nodded. "And what has changed?" I looked toward the window. "It no longer closes fully," I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied. He turned to Gray. "The cycle has been interrupted," Holmes said. Gray shook his head immediately. "No," he said, "it has adapted." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Adapted to what?" Gray looked toward Holmes directly now. "To you." A silence followed that statement. Lestrade looked alarmed. "What does that mean?" Holmes did not answer him. Instead he stepped closer to the window. Now only a small gap remained open, enough to suggest air, but not enough to define exterior. Holmes spoke softly. "You are mistaken," he said. Gray frowned. "About what?" Holmes replied. "You assume I am the observer." A pause, sir. "But I am not." At that moment something shifted again, not physically, but structurally. The room felt as though it had slightly reoriented itself, like a mechanism acknowledging a previously unaccounted-for component. Lestrade looked between us both. "Holmes, what are you saying?" Holmes turned toward him. "I am saying," he replied calmly, "that I did not arrive here as an external observer." A pause. "I arrived as part of the system's resolution." Gray took a sharp breath. "No," he said again more urgently, "that is not possible." Holmes nodded once. "It is," he said, "because the window does not open onto the outside." A silence fell. Even Lestrade did not interrupt. Holmes continued, his voice steady. "It opens onto the condition that defines observation." He stepped slightly back. "And I have now observed it completely." At that moment the window gave a soft final sound, not closing, not opening, but settling, as though accepting completion. Gray whispered, "It has finished the iteration." Holmes turned to him. "Yes," he said quietly. Then he added, "And now it will select the next observer." Lestrade stepped back instinctively. "What does that mean?" he demanded. Holmes looked at the window for a long moment, then said, "It means we are no longer inside the room." A pause. "We are inside what the room remembers." And at that exact moment, the window opened fully. Yet I must ask my reader to pause upon that statement, for it does not convey what I witnessed in that room. To say the window opened suggests a transition from one state to another entrance, an exposure, a connection with the exterior world. But there was no exterior. At least, none that could be confirmed by the senses in any ordinary manner. For when the sash reached its final position, there was no view of Montague Street, no fog-bound alley, no brick wall opposite the lodging-house. There was instead a kind of absence of continuation, a visual interruption, as though the world beyond had failed to maintain agreement with the frame. Lestrade uttered a short, involuntary sound. What is that?" he whispered. Holmes did not move. "It is the correct state," he said quietly. "Mr. Adrian." Gray, who had until this point remained fixed in place, now stepped back slowly until his legs met the edge of the bed. He did not sit. He simply remained there, as though unsure whether movement beyond that point was still permitted. Holmes advanced one step toward the window. "Observe carefully," he said. I did so. At first I thought I was looking into darkness, but darkness implies depth, and this had none. Then I thought it might be fog, but fog implies motion, and this was entirely still. It was something more unsettling, a space that did not confirm whether it was behind the glass or within it. Lestrade turned sharply toward Holmes. "This is some trick," he said. "Some mechanical device hidden in the frame." Holmes interrupted gently. "No," he said. He raised his hand slightly toward the window, but did not touch it. "This is not a mechanism," Holmes continued. "It is a resolution." At that word Gray spoke again urgently now. "Do not complete it," he said. Holmes turned slightly toward him. "You believe completion is harmful," Holmes said. Gray nodded quickly. "It ends the correction," he said. "And then it starts again, but differently." Holmes considered this. "Yes," he said. A pause. "That is usually the consequence of completion." Lestrade looked between them in increasing agitation. "Holmes, if this is some kind of philosophical exercise, I assure you I have had enough of it. We need to leave this room immediately." Holmes did not respond. Instead, he turned his attention fully to Gray. "Tell me," Holmes said calmly, "what was the first observer's mistake?" Gray hesitated. "They looked directly at it without leaving the room." Holmes nodded once. "And what did that cause?" Gray swallowed. "It anchored them." A silence followed. Holmes stepped back slightly from the window. "And what happened after anchoring?" he asked. Gray's voice lowered. "They became part of the cycle." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said quietly. "That explains persistence." Lestrade stepped forward sharply. "Holmes, this is meaningless. People do not become part of cycles. This is not science." Holmes finally turned toward him. "Inspector," he said calmly, "you are standing in a room where cause and effect are no longer sequential." A pause. "That alone should be sufficient to suspend your certainty." Lestrade hesitated, but only for a moment. Then from above us came the final sound. Not a step, not a movement, but something like arrival becoming awareness. Holmes looked upward briefly. "Yes," he said softly. "It has aligned fully," Gray whispered. "It is selecting now." Lestrade backed away slightly. "Selecting what?" Holmes turned toward the window again. "An observer," he said. The window remained fully open, but the absence beyond it no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like attention. Holmes stepped forward one final time. "Now," he said quietly, "we conclude the observation." Lestrade moved to intervene. "Holmes, stop!" But Holmes raised his hand. "No," he said firmly, and then very calmly, "it is already concluded." A pause. Then Holmes added almost softly, "And I have already been observed." At that moment Mr. Gray exhaled sharply, as though something within him had finally released. "It will not close again," Gray said. Holmes nodded once. "No," he agreed. "It will not close again." A silence followed. Then Holmes turned to me. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes?" He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Make note of this carefully." I nodded. Holmes continued, "The window was never the anomaly." A pause. It was the boundary condition for observation itself. He stepped back from the window. "And now," he said, "it has selected its next context." The air in the room shifted, subtly. Finally, as though something unseen had withdrawn its attention from Montague Street entirely. The window remained open, but what lay beyond it was no longer absence. It was elsewhere. Holmes picked up his hat. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. Lestrade stared. "Where are you going?" Holmes paused at the door, then replied, "Back to Baker Street." A pause. "And to prepare for the case that has already begun elsewhere." And with that Sherlock Holmes left the room that would not close because it no longer needed to.